a list of targets that you want to be eliminating, moving your mouse as little as possible and as efficiently as possible while you're doing this. And of course, there's going to be the first fast flick and then a micro adjustment afterwards, if you need it. Think about consciously while you're doing target switching of minimizing the amount of micro adjusting that you need to do. If you watch some of the best target switchers out there, like Une, here though to talk about our next video in the series, the third main topic of the overall aim mechanics, which is target switching. And in this video, we're going to be talking, typically target switching is broken into two different types of target switching. One is flick target switching, and then the other is more evasive target switching. We're going to be talking about flick or speed target switching, as it's referred to depending on which benchmarks you're looking at. What is target switching? Target switching is essentially your ability to move your crosshair quickly between two targets. Typically, this is two targets that are on a wide angle. It's usually referring to low TTK or time to kill. Basically, it doesn't take a very long time to eliminate the targets. COD is a pretty common example of a type of game where there's a lot of target switching because there's so many targets on screen, and you have a lot of ammo in your weapon, and it doesn't take a lot of damage to kill people. So you'll see it often if there's a lot of targets on screen that need to be eliminated quickly, or in games that have higher TTK like Apex Legends, there are multiple targets on wide angles. Or if there's kind of like a spray transfer situation where you're doing damage to one target, and then instead of not shooting, stopping firing your gun and then moving to another target, you just quickly flick to another target to continue in that same clip doing damage to the next target. And this is used for multiple different reasons in FPS games. One is to keep pressure on multiple different enemies. It's for optimizing damage uptime. If you know you have so many bullets in your gun, and if you run out of bullets, you have to switch to a second gun normally as a backup gun. There's a lot of time involved with that. You know, microseconds that can add up. Actually, in FPS games, the time it takes for you to switch to a second gun could be enough time for the enemy to kill you. There's somebody behind a door or hiding in a corner, or you just didn't see that they were there. You weren't aware of their presence. And then if you're good at target switching, you can quickly flick your gun and point your gun at them and start doing damage to them. Whereas if you weren't good at target switching, they would probably be able to start shooting you and kill you before you could kill them. So what do speed, target switching, or TS benches test you on? Most people think that the most important skill that you need in target switching is speed, your ability to move your mouse across the mouse pad as quickly as possible. While that's true, I mean, it's in the name, right? Speed, TS. What it's really testing you on is your ability to quickly acquire a target, flick to it, and then stay on target while tracking it and using as few bullets as possible. And so what you need there is flick accuracy. You need stability after flicking. So when you land on a target, if you move your mouse very quickly, often what happens is your hand does this little movement. It's like a little shake, right? Because you are moving at a high momentum. Your hand's moving at a high momentum, and so when you need to stop, you need stopping power, right? Unless your hand is stable, your crosshair is going to wiggle off of the target, and then you're not doing damage to it in that time. Static has a built-in technique called micro adjusting to help you with your flick accuracy. Like basically, if you're not as good at landing on your targets when you flick to them, you can do the micro adjustment and move on, right? But in target switching, you are penalized a lot heavier for your flick accuracy, for your shakiness, for waste and movement, unclean lines, over and under flicking. A lot of what we're going to be talking about is actually improving that component of your aim technique. And it's something that you should be consciously thinking about when you're training for target switching. Settings wise, you'll be using a higher FOV than you're used to in most of the target switching scenarios. 115 to 125 Overwatch is usually recommended. I use 115 for pretty much everything except for the PAT TS sends or 360 sends. If you're doing any that have like a 360 angle, you'll actually see in the Voltaic benches and guides, they usually suggest using source FOV, and I think that's a little much. I personally would just stick to 115 and 125 Overwatch. And the reason for this is because in order for you to be able to flick to targets, you need to be able to see them and know they're there. So a lot of times you're going to have no targets visible to you on screen because of the fact that they're just off screen, and you know they're off screen, but you don't know exactly where they are. So you just kind of like mindlessly flick and hope that you land near it, and then you have to correct. You just kind of want to minimize that. It just reduces the randomness There's going to be plenty of opportunities for you to do kind of like a mysterious flick, so don't worry, you're going to be building that technique. And in terms of like the targets, the colors, the walls, you could just follow the moving dots backgrounds generally. I also just use solid color walls. You can use either one. The targets are going to be moving, so having some kind of lines in the background like brick or concrete tiles can help you notice their movement and track their movement better. And sensitivity wise, so I actually like using a higher sens on target switching, and it feels fine for me. You might have some trouble with it at first. I run at 21 cm for most of the target switching sens. I think it helps with developing your stability and your smoothness because you're basically raising the skill ceiling a bit. And you'll find if you can get used to it, you'll find it just feels better because of the often you're doing really wide flicks. So it's just using less of your mouse pad to do it, ultimately, is what it comes down to if you're able to control that sensitivity. The primary technique is building on what you learned in static, except now you're holding down mouse 1. And a lot of people ask, why do you hold down mouse 1? So we hold down mouse 1 for a couple of reasons. One is to optimize your damage uptime and to optimize your scores. Obviously, it's sort of like Pokeball in that sense. If you did a lot of Pokeball training in static, this will be very familiar to you. It helps you understand the weight of the mouse under your hand. It helps you with spray transferring. I talked about spray transferring a little bit earlier. In real games and real fights in FPS, a lot of the times when you're doing target switching, you're doing it with the mouse held down. You think you might be wasting a lot of bullets. It's actually better to do that because once you get good at target switching and you have clean, accurate flicks, you actually don't lose that many bullets at all along the way. The ability for you to do damage that much quicker to the target because you don't have to wait for your gun to spin up, especially if there's spin up associated with it, that's time that you're wasting that you could actually be doing damage to a target. Like I mentioned, this is going to be very similar to static in terms of what you should be prioritizing. You want to prioritize clean lines. You want to prioritize target, lose the weight of the mouse. Static, except now you're holding down mouse 1. And a lot of people ask, why do you hold down mouse 1? So we hold down mouse 1 for a couple of reasons. One is to optimize your damage uptime and to optimize your scores. Obviously, it's sort of like Pokeball in that sense. If you did a lot of Pokeball training in static, this will be very familiar to you. It helps you understand the weight of the mouse under your hand. It helps you with spray transferring. I talked about spray transferring a little bit earlier. In real games and real fights in FPS, a lot of the times when you're doing target switching, you're doing it with the mouse held down. You think you might be wasting a lot of bullets. It's actually better to do that because once you get good at target switching and you have clean, accurate flicks, you actually don't lose that many bullets at all along the way. The ability for you to do damage that much quicker to the target because you don't have to wait for your gun to spin up, especially if there's spin up associated with it, that's time that you're wasting that you could actually be doing damage to a target. Like I mentioned, this is going to be very similar to static in terms of what you should be prioritizing. You want to prioritize clean lines. You want to prioritize moving from target to target and understanding what your next target's going to be ahead of time. So you have like what is referred to as like a kill chain. You have a list of targets that you want to be eliminating, moving your mouse as little as possible and as efficiently as possible while you're doing this. And of course, there's going to be the first fast flick and then a micro adjustment afterwards if you need it. Think about consciously while you're doing target switching of minimizing the amount of micro adjusting that you need to do. If you watch some of the best target switchers out there like Unans, Gord, you will see that they very rarely need to micro adjust. So the priority of your effort to improve should be focused around minimizing waste. In terms of priority order of what you want to be looking at when you're reviewing your VODs or just paying attention to while you're practicing is your stability in your flicks, your flick accuracy and your precision, basically, how clean your lines are when going from target to target, your target selection and choosing the right targets in the right order. And then near the bottom, speed last. I know it sounds crazy because it's speed. I'm saying when you're practicing, I'm not saying that you don't move fast. You should be moving at a faster rate. Like you should still be doing a fast flick, but don't think that speed is the first thing that you need to work on and develop. Unlike moving dots, the penalties for having jitter are much greater here. The difference between okay runs and great runs are due to how often you can land on the target for a flick and how stable you are tracking it after the flick. In moving dots, you will feel a little bit of like kind of shakiness in your hand, and that's pretty normal because it's largely centered around fingertip aim, and that's just how your hand's going to feel, especially when you're moving towards smaller and smaller targets. In TS though, you really need to, especially when you get toward small targets, as you improve, like that's gonna penalize you greatly. So you just need to understand that TS runs on very thin margins, and getting higher scores usually involves correcting minor mistakes that you're making, which add up over time. You don't want to linger on targets and need to absolutely see it's dead before moving on. A lot of times you're actually going to be moving off the target before it's fully dead. So that last little bit of damage that you need to do to kill it happens as you're flicking off of it, if that makes sense. It's really about optimizing, doing just the right amount of damage that you need and keeping uptime on the targets as you're moving your mouse across the playing field. Now, as far as target selection, viability, reading the map, when we talked about moving dots, and you might want to refer back to my other video if you want to revisit that topic, in TS Sens, you're applying the same technique. So, and this is why I wanted to put TS in this order after moving dots, because you're kind of building on what you're learning. A big part of viability now includes how the scoring works. Before, in static and moving dots, you're scored on whether or not you just kill a target, period. There's not a certain amount of damage. In target switching, you are actually scored based on the amount of damage for almost all the scenarios that you do, whether or not you kill a bot. Okay, and that's very important to understand, because a lot of times when you're deciding on which targets that you should be prioritizing, you should be prioritizing.
Imagine Facebook ads, Google ads,
the ones that are closer to the center of the map, instead of constantly going out toward the edges of the map unless you have to. And you should be prioritizing switching to the bots that are either currently the most viable because there are other targets near it in a kill chain, because you're thinking of how you can eliminate the most amount of targets in the least amount of time, or because it is moving in a direction that's both an expected direction after you switch to it, and it's going to lead to you being able to kill more bots that are in the same area. And you want to just get in this habit of continually accurately flicking to your targets and moving on if either you don't do enough damage to fully kill it because you misread the TTK on it, or because it moves in a direction that you didn't expect. When we're thinking about reading the map and you're thinking about viability, those are some of the things that you should be putting in the forefront of your mind, is, you know, not just clusters of bots, but where are they going to move after you flick to them? How much damage do you need to do to eliminate them? How much damage do they have they already incurred? Are there other bots nearby that are also moving in a similar direction that you can read ahead of time in your periphery as you're building your tempo? And also a willingness to move off of a bot if it doesn't meet your viability criteria, or if you've already started to do damage to it and it's actually going to be faster for you to flick off of it than it will be to continue to try to do that last bit of damage to kill it, because you're just scored on how much damage that you're doing to the bots overall and not how many you've killed. So along similar lines, this is probably where I would start suggesting that you pay attention to bot patterns. I did mention pattern learning a little bit in moving dots, and with target switching, I think it's very important to understand the physics of how the bots move, and it's also very important to understand how the maps are laid out and where bots can spawn. You might be thinking, well, is this cheating or defeating the purpose of game training? I mean, if you are basically memorizing where bots are, and I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is because it's playing an FPS game like Apex or Valorant or Overwatch. It's very common for people to go into like firing range type situations to understand what the recoil is, what the physics are like, what the TTK is like, right? Because in your head, you're just kind of establishing, you know, what is and isn't possible. And I think it's very important with target switching, because there's so many targets that pop up on screen and there's a low TTK. The actual like patterns of where you can expect things to happen starts to become a lot more relevant. Like if you were just doing a tracking scenario that just had an invincible bot, you know that bot is just going to be the only target that's available to you on screen. But if you're doing target switching, because you're killing so many bots and they're coming from so many different directions, those little nuances add up. And if you start moving your crosshair from like 0 degrees to 180 degrees and back to 0 over and over and over again, you're basically just killing your score because you're not paying attention to the strategy of the map and how to approach it. So you can do this with trial and error. You can look at VODs. You can watch aimers on YouTube that are doing the scenarios like Vox TS, Pat TS, just to kind of see what's the art of possible. You can also do the static versions of the scenarios if they exist. We're going to talk about that a little bit in the scenario types and the beneficial routines. What could end up happening if you are playing the scenarios incorrectly is you might be getting lower scores just because you're not solving the problem of the map correctly. You could actually be doing the technique. So it's very important to help you isolate what you need to improve and how to improve. So the different scenario types, this is a lot more simplified in TS. I ended up grouping them into 2 different types, and that's the moving type of target switching scenarios and then the static ones. So in the moving ones, the popular ones are like Dev TS, Zen. You've got the Tile Frenzy ones, kind of the old school ones. Pat TS is probably one of the most popular types out there. It's been around forever. It's evolved over time. It used to be like more like a human figure type bot with a reload, and now it's just a little circle. Generally doesn't have reload. And Vox TS is another really popular one. Vox and Pat are probably the two best that you can do. I really like Zen too, because Zen gives you the wide angles, and there are static versions of these scenarios. Most of them, I would say maybe even all of them. What separates them really is the various viewing angles that you get. The most common one that you're going to see is really like a 180 type of viewing angle, and that's why we always recommend to play at a higher FOV so that you can see more of the screen. But there's also 90-degree viewing angles, kind of the easier ones that focus more on speed. And then there's the 360-degree viewing angles to help with those wide angle switches. Viscose is somebody who really values prioritizing those 360-degree switches to help get better at hitting those real almost guesswork switches, like one side of the screen to the next. And then there's Psalm TS. I didn't really know where to fit this in because it does have some amount of evasiveness to it, even though it's on just one plane. Like it doesn't move further away from you or closer to you like they do in the evasive scenarios like Kin TS, but it does have like a wave pattern that it does versus just a normal horizontal plane movement. So it's not quite evasive, but it doesn't really fit into all the other ones like Zen, Dev, Tile, Pat, and Vox. For the static ones, you've got a lot of the Pokeball ones. Pokeball Wide R-Aim is a popular one. You know, Pat, Pure Switch Benchmark has Pokeball sends, and then of course it's got the various angles like 90, 180, 360. So, and what's the difference between Pokeball for static versus TS might be, you know, a question that you're asking yourself. And for the most part, the techniques are very similar. I would say they're almost the exact same. Pokeballs and static, they're normally closer together. You've got like hipfire ones, you've got Pokeball Frenzy types. Once you get into the really wide wall type scenarios, then it becomes much more like a target switching type scenario. And why is that? And I think for me, it's because the situations that you encounter in FPS games that do require target switching, where it is much more of like a target switching type technique, is when it's a fast kind of like wide flick that does require an amount of stability. Trying to think of it in slow motion where your hand goes like this and then it has to kind of correct itself afterwards, right? It has to stabilize itself, and you don't really get that with the smaller dot clusters. So what we can do now is kind of go through a few routines. This is well-tread territory, so there's no benefit to me creating a new routine. And speed TS sends are pretty straightforward. It's kind of like static, like it's more about getting a lot of reps in than it is about specific routines. So I broke these into 3 different categories of routines that focus on different things. The first one being speed, which is going to be what most people kind of gravitate toward as being their problem. What speed routines typically feature are a combination of big bots, so like jumbo versions of scenarios, like Vox TS Voltaic Jumbo. And a lot of them also include wide angles. This one I really like. This is by Gord. It's you run it in total random. Focus is not just on speed, but on speed and
মানুষের ধারণা গেমাররা
technique. It has all of the kind of primary speed TSNs that you would want to practice, like Vox and Pat, and then it has variations of them. Like the Viscose variant is a really great scenario because it starts with big bots and then slowly moves towards smaller ones. What happens if you just focus on jumbo sends, for example, like your brain knows that all the bots are going to be big, so you could end up developing bad technique. What you need to kill big bots isn't what you need to kill small bots. Very strongly suggest when you're running the jumbo versions of bots, if you're doing the speed scenarios, is not to overlook your technique while you're killing the bots. It's easy to kind of like start swooping around and not having straight lines. So pay attention to how you're eliminating the bots and still prioritize your technique while you're doing them. And you might even find that your hand and arm is getting a little worn out because you're going at a high speed, which is the point of the scenario, is to kind of get comfortable with moving at a higher speed than you might normally do. I really like the Unans Just Move Your Hand Faster. It features 90-degree versions of the Pat TS, for example, which I like the easy and the 90-degree versions because it simplifies what it is. The primary technique is building on what you learned in static, except now you're holding down mouse 1. And a lot of people ask, you know, why do you hold down mouse 1? So we hold down mouse 1 for a couple of reasons. One is to optimize your damage uptime and to optimize your scores. Obviously, it's sort of like... So do your flicks and target switches look like this yet? Not to worry. We're going to be answering all your burning questions from watching the flick target switching video. And if you haven't watched it yet, go back and check it out. And if you're new to the series, we're going through each of the 6 major aim mechanics and talking about how you can improve in FPS games using Kovacs or AimLab aim trainers. So let's jump right into the questions. So the first one is more of a general question, but are you still using a Sens randomizer for practice? I get asked this a lot, and I think as a randomizer is useful earlier on in your aim training when you're creating a lot of errors and basically learning specifically through creating errors. I've been actually learning a lot about how the human brain works. I'm going to make a video on this in the future, but early on in your skill learning, you want to just be creating as many errors as possible in a dense amount of time. Randomizers can kind of help raise the skill ceiling there. You just want to avoid, getting too frustrated to the point where you walk away. It's very important that you keep training when you are frustrated so that you reinforce the concept of improvement being associated with frustration so that your brain can kind of like reshape itself based on what you're learning. So randomizers help with that. They specifically are most beneficial, I think, in reactivity tracking, which we'll talk about in another video. A non-topic question, but it's the best top 3 reactivity plays for beginners and intermediate players. Reactivity is probably the hardest aim mechanic. Especially for newer players. There's no real secret to approaching reactivity. We'll talk about it when I get to reactivity tracking, but I would say early on, one of the best scenarios that you can practice that's kind of on the bridge between smooth tracking and reactivity is smooth thin strafes. And if you're playing Aim Lab, I think it's called needle track strafe. Air Angelic is another great one to help with learning reactivity in a smooth way. Those are the 2 scenarios I would really recommend playing early on. There's no real playlists that I would suggest for reactivity tracking until you get better at it. So curious on my thoughts for training on a higher sense to develop mouse control, even double your sens. Yeah, this is super common. Most great aimers that I've seen, like Torge, I think that's how it's pronounced. I've been pronouncing it Torge, sorry. He trains around 30 cm and plays at a lower sensitivity in Apex. I think he's like Nova Complete or something now. One of many, many examples. There's tons of great aimers out there that play on a higher sensitivity. Basically because you're just raising your skill ceiling. Like you're raising the challenge, which as I mentioned before is creating errors so that you can improve. Like if you're playing aim training to improve and not just to kind of like hone your existing skill or to
অনিশো কি পাগলা গরম আরে চিপ করে দেখো চুপকায় গেল পুরো
warm up or something, then you want to be creating errors so that you can just constantly be improving until you hit like some cap that I don't think anybody's hit yet. There's no real, you'll probably read some Twitter posts from like Aimer7 or you'll see it on Reddit about like specifically training at double your sins. There's no rule. Like it doesn't matter if you're specifically double or like 1.5. I mean, just basically increase your sensitivity if you want to increase the difficulty. Is a stable frame rate more important than frames? If you're experiencing micro stuttering and it's noticeably affecting you, like unable to track targets or see what's going on because of it, then yeah, you probably should stabilize your frame rate. But generally, less input lag. One of the easiest ways to reduce your input lag is to get more frames if possible. Generally, you want to be getting more frames. Some games are poorly optimized, like Apex Legends is infamous for this. I don't know if they fixed it yet, but most people cap their frames around 180 FPS, even if they can go way higher just because they get micro stutters. Oh, and a follow-up question, if for some reason you have to cap your frames in aim trainers but play at a different frame rate in your FPS game, is it a big difference? I would say no. I mean, I think people overemphasize the importance that frame rate has like on your aim. I think NVIDIA actually just did this weird little latency test, and it does definitely, input lag definitely affects your ability to move your mouse. If it's like so noticeable where you move your mouse, half a second later you see it move, okay, that's really bad, you know, but generally there's between 60 FPS and 120 FPS, it's not going to be that major. I'm curious what you're going to say. Precise tracking, the common advice is just track better. I mean, you see a lot of like move hand fast, like just generic advice in the aim community, like just do better, be better, bro. There's more to it than that. There definitely is a case to be made though, that I would say some people really overanalyze every single nuance of what they should be doing when aim training, when really they just need to get more reps in. When you're early on in your aim improvement, sub like 200 hours aim training, I mean, just as a general point of view, if you have tens of thousands of hours in FPS first, then obviously that won't apply to you. You haven't been aim training a lot. You need to just practice the scenarios. There's no magic to improvement when you're learning a skill other than getting reps in. Like that's a big part of learning how to improve. Any advice on improving stability while applying the Bartos method, which is, one fast flick and then a micro adjustment? One of the more important things to focus on as you get really good at flicking and you get a lot better at micro flicks and speed, you need to emphasize your stopping power, and you need to ensure your technique one where you aren't having to tense up in order to stop. Like you should be prioritizing under flicking, confidently stopping on the target and stopping resolutely, I think, as Gord puts it. Great advice, great word to describe that. And then as you're practicing in this method and you're consciously thinking about it, your stopping power is going to improve and your stability is going to improve. So one of the biggest reasons that I see that people lack stability when they're flicking is because they're overemphasizing the speed when they're moving their mouse, and they're not emphasizing enough on the technique when they're stopping. I actually found not holding M1 to be a good exercise. I think referring to the fact that most people in target switching scenarios hold down mouse 1 for the whole time. I know of a lot of people that actually have a hard time with holding down mouse 1 the whole time. There's certainly a lot of scenarios in game where you aren't going to hold down mouse 1 when you're going between targets. So there's no major downside to not doing it, but I would definitely at least spend some time holding down mouse 1 to develop that technique. How do you make the targets glow? Like in some parts of the video, I covered that in the description. You can go to the Twitter post where you can do that in Kovacs. Did you know a texture for floor and walls that I can use for all scenarios? Changing them is annoyingly inconvenient. Yeah, it kind of sucks. I just kind of keep pure color almost all the time unless I'm specifically doing a ton of tracking. So you can just do that. It's just an optimization thing. It's not going to hurt you if you keep pure color on everything. Is the way they count scores in AimLab the same? That's a great question, because I talked about in Flick TS and also in dynamic clicking all the different types of scoring and how to optimize the scoring. As far as I can tell in AimLab, there's only one flat scoring method. It's either penalizing you on accuracy linearly or it's not. I think that's all there is to it. There's no weird like square root accuracy or anything. You should make a video on our Sens randomizer. I already did, and I linked it. How have I been doing as of recent? I've been doing well. Thank you for asking. I have been, during the holidays, it's always chaotic. Finding a lot more free time right now. I've been trying to change my setup, get good setup going, get my office straight. Nerdy things. We just got a video 2 weeks ago. Something wrong. Yeah, I know. I'm trying to make more content for you, the viewer. Okay, now a little bonus for the people that commented on my community post where I was talking about the progress I made on the next video, which at this point is probably about 80% done. I'm gonna go through the questions here. First one being, care to elaborate on grip, pressure, and tension in hands affecting aim? Okay, so there's two main things I want to talk about with this question. It's very important that you understand that your arm, your hand, your wrist, your shoulder is a complex instrument, essentially, that is attached to your body. It has muscles, it has nerves. It's very easy to overlook the importance of stretching, of treating your body correctly. When I was a lot younger, I didn't put as much emphasis on stretching and taking care of myself. I started to get RSI, repetitive strain injury, just because I was always on the computer. I was part of kind of like the first generation of children that grew up around PCs, and there isn't as much information as there is now on like proper posture and, you know, good equipment, like good chairs, for example, like standing desks, those sort of thing. The most important thing that you need to manage when you're aim training and when you're playing FPS games is to not over grip your mouse. Like people talk about tension and grip pressure in that context almost primarily for that reason, because you can give yourself more stability and more stopping power by tensing, you know, and by pushing down on the mouse pad, for example. But in the long run, that's not good for your health. So that's one thing that you want to keep in mind. I mean, I'm not your dad. Do whatever you want, but just know that you could be putting yourself, like if you want to be competitive, you want to be in the competitive scene long term, you could put yourself out of commission completely. And then your run's over. This happens all the time. People don't emphasize this enough. So it's just something that you really want to think about. I would very strongly suggest it. So the second thing is, it's actually better technique to think about stability, not in the context of making a strong mouse movement, and instead in a relaxed manner, kind of decelerating. If you're finding yourself needing to, after like a flick, for example, very concretely hold your mouse with tension, you need to reevaluate how you're approaching your technique. And you need to focus more on under flicking and focus more on kind of decelerating as you approach the bot. You know, actively think about your tension in your hand when you're doing this. And over time, it's going to improve, and you'll find it's actually a better technique to have, because eventually it becomes a bottleneck where if you're constantly you're over flicking and having to flick back, especially if a bot's moving or target's moving like this, you're going to always be behind. You're just going to fail to hit your target, especially once you start to get to reactive tracking. So it's just a good habit to get into. You elaborate more on stability after flicks, the way you would practice it. There's specific techniques you think are worth trying and implementing. So that's almost exclusively related to what I was just talking about. Actually, there's another question along the same lines. Really focus on Pokeball scenarios, and really focus on when you're doing Pokeball scenarios, under flicking. Prioritize it. think about it. Specifically Pokeball scenarios, I would say microflick, like hip fire scenarios are good for this. Gord actually just released a routine on microflicking, which has a lot of these types of scenarios. Also Bill, B-I-L, has a static playlist that he's refreshing every week or so. The latest one has a lot of Pokeball on it, which is good for this. And again, you have to think about underflicking and stopping on the target when you're playing, so that you're not just rotely going through the scenarios and the routine, but actually thinking about your technique while you're doing it. The initial flick and micro are great for stability but the stability after micro is really, really lacking. It causes delay or misclicks when speed increases. Now that's exactly what I'm talking about, is prioritizing your underflicks and prioritizing working on Pokeball. Like, you will develop that technique as you practice more and more. If you just hard push flicking scenarios and like get better and better at that without valuing Pokeball and without valuing underflicking, your stability is going to suffer. How to stay on target as soon as the bot switches directions. So we're going to talk about that a lot in the smooth tracking. It is related to accelerating and decelerating. It is related to not predicting. The biggest problem that most people have, especially when they're starting out, not reading the target, and they're not waiting for the bot to change directions before they try flicking back to the target, and it causes them to kind of do one of these little numbers where they're like shaking their hand. It might seem like you're getting lower scores focusing on reading the target because you're absolutely having to wait until it switches before you move back to it, but that's the right technique. Teach me the ways of Azrim. I have no idea what that is. How to adjust onto target quickly, smoothly, and without going past the target. I feel like readjusting onto the target after it's trace is difficult with fast and thin bots. Oh, good point. I mean, it's related to what I was saying earlier, but with thinner bots, it becomes more and more noticeable. All right. You really will see where you're flicking past, and that's because you're really just flicking too fast. It's better, in my opinion, when a bot changes direction. Like if you're talking about a tracking thin bot, like say smooth thin strafes, it's better to kind of drag slightly behind the bot if you're smoothly adjusting to its changing direction, rather than flicking past it and then having to come back. And the reason for that is because once you start getting into reactive scenarios, or if you start getting into flicking target switch type scenarios or micro flick scenarios with lots of bots, all of those little micro corrections that you're having to make are going to add up to major score losses. And in game, it's going to result in you getting bodied, just because if you're playing against somebody who's really good at strafing reactively and you can't keep up with them, like you're just going to lose a fight. Teaching yourself purposefully kind of smoothly reacting back to changes in direction instead of flicking past and then looking back is a better technique to learn. How can you get fast, snappy aim without shaking? Is it just DS and static, or how can I achieve that type of aim? There's a lot of things that go into that. So like, I would say that that's very context dependent. One of the things is kind of purposefully playing at different sensitivities so that you can train different muscle groups, because I mean, your hand and your shoulder and your arm, like I said before, is muscles. So you do have to build up tiny, micro fibers that exist. Like think about if you're doing weightlifting, instead of just sitting, like let's say you want to bench, instead of just sitting there and like lifting the heaviest weight that you could possibly lift fast and with poor technique, you want to very slowly raise the bar and then very slowly let it come back down. And you're doing that so you can build up all the muscles around the major muscle groups that support it, so it's very similar in your aim training. A lot of your shakiness could be due to you not focusing on certain muscle groups that are in your hand, your wrist, your arm. Another one is, like I said, tension. Like that's the number one thing that people assume when they talk about shakiness. Shaky aim is tension, is over gripping your mouse, like we talked about earlier. Could also just be because you're working on one sensitivity only certain types of scenarios that emphasize specific parts of your arm and only those specific parts of your arm. So forcing yourself to use different parts of your arm, forcing yourself to use different parts of your pad that you're used than what you're used to, changing sensitivities, trying static on 20 cm instead of 50 or 60 cm, or vice versa. Just like moving around like that and be more dynamic about your training. Over time, you'll build up those muscle groups, and then you'll get better and you won't be as shaky. Incorporate aim labs into your videos, you will get wider reaching audiences. Yes, that is actually in my next video. I am going to be focusing very heavily on aim lab, and I'm glad you brought that up because aim lab has really come a long way now. I didn't like it maybe 6 months ago. It was way too clunky. It's still kind of clunky, but they're slowly improving it. And really the biggest change that happened is that Rivasect, formerly known as Respectful Aim, built tons of great scenarios in aim lab now. Like you could just do a Control F in aim lab and type RA and then look at all of the scenarios that they have. And one of the coolest things that kind of came out of it is, I mean, if you go to Kovacs, there's like tens of thousands of scenarios, right? But so what they did is they selected some of the best in breed that has evolved over the years in Kovacs and brought them into AimLab. So you're kind of, it's a more focused group of some of the best scenarios that you can train on. So it's really cool. Definitely try AimLab if you haven't tried it. Definitely run the RivaSec benchmarks if you haven't played them. So yeah, the next video, I'm going to be focusing a lot on both Kovacs and AimLab if you don't have the money to play Kovacs or you don't want to pay for it. So that's all the questions. Be on the lookout for the Smooth Track vid coming out in the next couple weeks, I want to say. I mean, it is a holiday, so it might take me a little bit longer to put it out. Thanks for watching this. Hope you find this useful. Please keep commenting in the YouTube videos so that I can answer questions like this if you have questions, and I'll see you next time.
কত মিলিয়ন রান্নায় পারফেকশন এনেছি গোনা হয়নি কত সাফল্যের আনন্দে মিশে গেছি
teaching you the proper technique so you can track like a pro. If you're new here and looking at the video length, getting ready to click away, do what you want, but I promise you, YouTube is filled with videos talking about how you can become an aim god, but don't actually teach you anything about how to aim. My content actually arms you with the info you need to immediately act on and start improving with no filler or fake promises. As always, I'm going to be giving you recommended scenarios and routines in Kovacs, FPS Aim Trainer. But don't worry if you don't want to shell out the $10 for Kovacs, we're going to be covering some AimLab tasks you can run as well, which is a free aim trainer. Make sure to check the description for timestamps and references. When it comes to sexy clips that people like to see, wide flicks and target switches are high up on the list. Tracking is kind of the unsung hero of aiming in FPS games because when executed well, it looks effortless. But make no mistake, it is a very difficult skill to master. I'm sure you've been in situations in FPS games where you just can't seem to hit your shots even when the enemy is moving in a predictable path. I know I have. Tracking is split into two main categories, reactive and smooth. In smooth tracking, our topic for today, you're primarily developing your ability to maximize your stability while keeping your crosshair on a target. Typically, this is on higher time to kill or TTK targets using guns with a high fire rate, but not always. This also includes your ability to react back to targets' changes and movement and quickly reacquire it to continue tracking it. But of course, targets in smooth tracking situations are more predictable, meaning they don't change direction and speed at a high frequency. So if you're doing the Voltaic or RivaSec benchmarks, they'll be testing you on your ability to maximize what I call crosshair uptime, which is essentially how long you can keep your crosshair on a target while shooting it. Sounds easy, right? Well, maybe not. There's a lot of fine motor movement and mouse control required to keep your crosshair where you want it and keeping it both smooth and stable. In FPS games themselves, this technique is super beneficial for minimizing bullet drop-off, so more of your bullets matter, eliminating targets more quickly, preferably before they kill you. It also makes better use of your inventory since you can effectively kill targets with less bullets. It becomes very apparent how useful smooth tracking is when using automatic guns in a mid-range or longer distance because targets become quite small, and jitter along with recoil results in far more missed shots. Something that's important to understand is that smooth tracking is an underlying major technique, as important as clicking, that you're developing. The foundation you're building here will apply majorly to other aim areas like evasive switching, dynamic clicking, and even static clicking, like when you're doing Pokeball scenarios. So don't skimp on developing the technique in favor of score chasing. For settings in your aim trainer, you'll be sticking with 103 Overwatch Field of View or FOV. There's no real advantage to setting it higher like there is in target switching. For backgrounds, it's better to use textures with lines, like concrete tiles and bricks are really popular at the moment. This helps you better understand bot movement and perceive depth. For sensitivity, you'll be running in your normal range. A good starting point is anywhere between 25 and 40 ACM a rev. You don't want to go too low with your sends like you would with static because some of the smooth tracking scenarios like Smoothbot have a decent amount of velocity and angles. Back in the day, people would cheese the benchmarks like Thin Gauntlet with a super low sensitivity. That's not really possible anymore. Plus, the foundation you're building here will transition into more and more reactive tracking, which will have higher velocity targets and start to penalize you if you haven't built good technique, especially when reacting to bot direction changes. When practicing smooth tracking, it's often recommended to train at a higher sensitivity than you normally play with or are comfortable with. This increases the challenge, makes you create errors, which ultimately helps you improve faster. As a general rule, playing at a higher sends uses more of your wrist and fingertips, and a lower sends will use more of your shoulder and arm. When training smoothness, pay attention to which parts of your arm that you're using that result in jitter, and adjust your sensitivity accordingly to focus on those areas. You can use a randomizer here with a significant benefit, almost as good as using one during reactive tracking scenarios. AimLab has a built-in randomizer. If you want to use one in Kovacs, you'll need to use a third-party program, which I cover in another video. Word of caution, if you use a third-party tool, there is a chance you'll get banned just for having the driver installed it uses to randomize your sends, so use at your own risk. For technique, when you're starting out, one of the most important things to pay attention to is over-predicting. Over-predicting is basically when you're too focused on the bot patterns and start to preemptively react to target movement changes because you're anticipating them to change direction. What you want to always focus on while training is to assume that the bot will continue in its current direction forever, then wait until you see it change direction and react back to the movement change. That way you're developing your read reading and reactivity skills. And while we're on the topic of reacting back to bot movement, it's very important to react back smoothly. By that I mean not flicking too hard and landing in front of the bot like you would in a flick target switching sen. Not only does this waste movement, it will cost you some habit unlearning later on when you move into more reactive tracking. You want your reaction to the target movement changes to feel smooth and relaxed, not tense and snappy.
On tension, Aquatic is a top aimer who's going for Nova this year, and he asks I highlight this in smooth tracking, since this will have a major impact on your mouse stability. Tension refers to the force that you apply to your mouse when gripping it, and which muscles are activated will depend a lot on the sensitivity you're using. So you might not notice how tensely you're holding the mouse until you start using higher sensitivities, and become jittery because you're simply gripping the mouse too tensely. So while you're aim training, you want to consciously think about keeping your mouse hand as neutral as possible. A recommended technique is to rebind your mouse 1 to something else like spacebar, so you could feel what a completely neutral position is like in your mouse hand, and then always strive to attain that level of tension, consciously thinking about it when you're aim training. I've also heard people suggest visualizing that you're holding something extremely fragile, like an egg or very thin glass, so you subconsciously hold your mouse delicately because you're worried the thing you're holding will break. Aquatic also suggests if you notice you're tensing in the middle of aim training, don't just restart the scenario, but actively think about relaxing the tension while you're playing this scenario. Over time, this will become more reflexive, meaning it's something that you'll do automatically. But especially at first, or when you're reviewing how to improve at smoothness, think about how tensely you are holding the mouse and how you can minimize it.
You also want to be watching the bot and not your crosshair pretty much always when doing smooth tracking. This is because you're partly developing your reading skills, which is essentially your ability to understand how a target is going to move on screen and react accordingly with your crosshair movement. Remember before how I mentioned crosshair uptime? Let's expand on that a bit. When you're training, you want to be prioritizing keeping your crosshair on the target even when it feels jittery. I see way too often players that are slightly in front of or behind the target and still following the same pattern and direction the bot's moving, even though they're not doing damage to it. What you want to do is pay attention to when your crosshair falls off the bot and micro correct to bring it back. This is especially true in scenarios like Popcorn Good at Tracking Invincible, also known as PGTI, or Smoothbot that have frequent velocity and angle changes. On the topic of resetting your mouse, due to the nature of smooth tracking sens, you're going to be encountering mouse resetting more than the other scenarios. By that we mean physically picking up your mouse to bring it back near the center of your pad when you run out of space. Resetting your mouse is not inherently bad. It happens, and learning how to properly reset your mouse quickly is a skill that you need to develop, because it will happen in firefights, and a good reset can mean the difference between winning and losing. There's two considerations here. One is try not to over reset just because you're on a part of your pad that you're not comfortable with. You want to get comfortable with parts of your pad, wrist, and arm that you aren't used to using. That's why you're aim training. The second is try to reset at a time when it is optimal, like when the bot pattern is the least viable. Remember when we talked about viability in other Crash Course videos? If not, make sure to go back and check those out. Basically, when the target is really difficult to hit anyways, like when its velocity is at its max or near the bottom of the arc with an arcing bot, that's when you want to prioritize resetting your mouse. That's pretty much it for technique with smoothness. This is a really straightforward mechanic that's difficult to master and just requires putting a lot of reps in. So to sum up, don't over predict. Assume the bot will keep going in its current direction forever, then react back when it changes direction. Pay attention to the bot and not the crosshair to build your reading skills. Focus on smoothly reacting back to bot changes. Prioritize crosshair uptime, micro correcting when your crosshair falls off the target. Allow yourself to be comfortable with parts of your pad you're not used to, and focus on mouse resetting at optimal times. So now I'll be going through each of the types of tracking scenarios available in Aim Trainers, which ones are useful to focus on, and what they help develop in your technique. I'm mostly going to be focusing on what I call big compound scenarios that are either very effective at what they isolate or are able to develop multiple adjacent techniques simultaneously. One important thing to note, in Kovacs especially, there's a lot of variations of these scenarios. To increase the difficulty, you could choose smaller bot versions of the scenarios I'm describing. How do you know when to increase difficulty? This is not a hard and fast rule, but shoot for 25 to 30% accuracy before increasing difficulty. Basically, you want to create errors and challenge yourself to the point of frustration during your learning bouts, which will cue your brain's attention to change in order to adapt and improve. On the other hand, if you want to decrease the difficulty, an easy way to do that in Kovacs is to change the timescale, which is essentially increases or decreases a bot's speed by a flat multiplier. You can change it to 0.7, for example, if it's too difficult, at the default number of 1. There doesn't seem to be a way to do this yet in AimLab, so you can just look for easy versions of the scenarios. For the AimLab scenarios I'll be covering, easiest way to get to them in AimLab is to just use Control F to find and type in the name or part of the name of the scenario. So the first type is one plane tracking, like horizontal or vertical tracking. Generally, these are predictable long strafes that help you focus exclusively on minimizing jitter on whichever bot direction you want. These will focus far less on your reading skills and more on your raw ability to consistently keep up with the bot movement and prevent your crosshair from falling off the target. When you're playing these, prioritize thinking about keeping your crosshair on the target center mass as you're following the strafe pattern, and consciously remind yourself to move the crosshair smoothly back to the target whenever it falls off. In Kovacs, you'll commonly see scenarios like centering, smooth your wrist, vertical long strafes, then gauntlet, I think that revolving tracking is one of the best scenarios per unit time to work on for horizontal, vertical smoothness popcorn, and vertical smooth Lapu for vertical training. In AimLab, look for scenarios like VT Thin Gauntlet AIO, and RA Thin Aiming Long Invincible, and RA Popcorn Vertical Smoothness. The next type is XY tracking. You'll want to graduate to these scenarios as soon as possible, and it's a very wide area, so I've broken them into different subgroups. The XY in this instance refers to the fact that bots will be moving across at least 2 dimensions, sometimes 3 depending on the scenario. These are some of the most beneficial scenario types you can train on because the bots are difficult to predict and require constant micro adjustments to stay on target. I've been learning a lot about how to optimize skill learning, and one of the mantras repeated is density of reps per unit time, meaning the more repetitions you can execute during a learning bout, especially as you're starting out learning a skill, in this case, aim training, the faster you learn a skill. And due to the bot physics and XY scenarios, you will be getting the most amount of dense reps in with these. So you've got the parabola type, probably the most famous or infamous scenario, and this is Popcorn Good at Tracking Invincible, or PGTI. The AimLab version of this is called Mini Sphere Voltaic, arguably one of the most useful aim training scenarios ever made. This features an arcing bot with very awkward angles near the peak of the jump. If you can withstand the frustration of this scenario, this would be one of the most useful ones that you can play. Bounce 180 Ti is in the same vein. In Kovacs, there's tons of variations of this scenario, another extremely useful type. You'll find Bounce 180 Ti, also known as B180 Ti, in AimLab as well, but the same name. I also sometimes see it listed as Arc 180 Ti and RA Bounce Track. The next type is what I just call spheres, which is mostly Smooth Sphere and Control Sphere, two of the best smoothest scenarios that you can train on. I'd also lump the Pass Through Track Invincible scenarios into this category. In AimLab, you'll see both Smooth and Control Sphere with the same name. RA also has a version called Precise Sphere, which is sort of a mix between Control and Smooth Sphere, and I really love that scenario. I kind of wish it was in Kovacs. Smooth Sphere features a longer strafe pattern and more arm focus, while Control focuses more on shorter strafes to focus more on wrist and fingertip movements. Pass Through Track is more a predictable bot pattern and features more of a diagonal movement with a brief pause between strafes. You'll see tons of variations of the scenario in Kovacs. In AimLab, you'll just see it listed as MPXY Invincible. Smoothbot's next. It has an interesting history. It came into prominence back when Sparky, at the time, it's now known as Voltaic, used Thin Gauntlet V2 as a tracking bench, and the community realized that people were gaming the scenario with super low sensitivities instead of actually focusing on improving their aim. Smoothbot then became the de facto replacement, which is much harder to cheese and forces you to develop technique. It features a bot with wide velocity swings, requiring you to use a lot of your mouse pad, and if you try to use a low sens to minimize jitter, you won't be able to keep up with the bot. It's one of the best smooth track sends to work on. In Kovacs, there's tons of variants. In AimLab, you'll see it listed with the same name or as Smooth Pill. The last XY type is Glider, and if you've ever played Fortnite, this will be familiar to you, as it replicates the glider you use when landing in that game. It features a smaller, difficult to hit bot with a smooth horizontal strafe, starting high up in the sky and slowly drifting back down to the ground. Not only is this a very practical situation to train, it's excellent for developing your smooth tracking technique. My favorite version in Kovacs is a pure glider version. You'll want to focus on aiming for the head to maximize your score, and the only version I can find in AimLab currently is RA Glider Track. The last smooth track scenario type is what I call reactive smoothness. These are the scenarios where you start to question whether it falls into reactive territory due to the frequent bot changes, but they serve as an excellent bridge to bring smoothness into reactivity, which is incredibly important to develop proper technique. Probably the most important scenario you can play is smooth thin strafes, aka needle track strafing in AimLab. The important technique to focus on is smoothly reacting back to bot changes. And what makes this scenario so fantastic is its unpredictable strafe pattern, mixing in a combination of long and short strafes. This helps you avoid predicting and forces you to develop smooth reactions to bot changes. Gord is a top aimer and someone I quote a lot, and she refers to proper technique as decelerating and reaccelerating. So instead of quickly flicking to the bot's change in movement, think of it more as decelerating when approaching the target and accelerating after approaching the target. If you spend a lot of time on static but avoided smoothness and tracking in general, this will be a difficult habit to get into, since reading isn't involved in static at all, and your first inclination will probably be to flick fast when the bot changes direction. Another great scenario to practice reactive smoothness is Air Angelic for Voltaic, also known as Angelic Sphere Voltaic and AimLab. Both of these will be fairly easy to find if you run Voltaic benches, since they are a benchmark scenario. Same technique and characteristic as smooth thin strafes, this just has XY movement and more frequent strafing. As a bonus in Kovacs at least, there's the other category for specialized smoothness practice. Things like Oblique and KVA, which features bots that quickly strafe at odd angles and perspectives, intended to replicate the experience of mid-range strafing in FPS games, or Circle Smoothness, which, you guessed it, features bots that goes in circles of varying sizes. If I had to make a list of all the best smooth track scenarios to work on, it would be Smooth Thin Strafes, Smooth Sphere, Control Sphere, Pure Glider, Smooth Bot, PGTI, and Revolving Tracking. Maybe throw in Bounce 180 Ti and Popcorn Vertical Smoothness for good measure. Doing all of these will give you full coverage of all the smoothness tracking acuity you need for FPS games. This section on routines is going to primarily focus on Kovacs. Unfortunately, the equivalent playlist feature in AimLab is extremely limited and buggy, and there's just not a lot of playlists out there yet. But where applicable, I am going to discuss the equivalent AimLab custom scenarios you can run. One thing you could do is check out the latest Voltaic Fundamental AimLab routines. They have a detailed routine list ranging from absolute beginner to around intermediate, and they'll be putting out advanced routines later. All the routines I'll be covering can be run in a one-by-one fashion, meaning you can run each scenario once and run the routine multiple times, and you can just play them in total random order. The first routine, definitely the most popular and well-known, is Pure G Smoothness, and with good reason. It's a phenomenal routine with pretty much full coverage of all the smoothness types I just described. It's got centering and vertical smoothness popcorn, it's got smoothbot, it's got gliders, bounce 180 tracking invincible, it has the hardest thin gauntlet bots. It's got it all really. Two of the best scenarios in Kovacs are on this playlist, Tam Target Switch Smooth and Control. These are also available in AimLab, by the way. They feature the same bot pattern as Smooth and Control Sphere, except they have bots that regenerate health, and there's more targets to choose from, so it's more akin to a target switching scenario. If you're going to run one smoothness routine only, this is the one for you. Note that there are multiple variants of this routine, basically just increasing or decreasing the difficulty, so I'll provide share codes and Kovacs in the YouTube description for all of them. Next you have Lapu, who put together some great smoothness routines. He's a grandmaster in Kovacs with over 3,000 hours in aim trainers and counting, and is just really good at putting together succinct and effective routines. There's two main routines he put together, each having 3 difficulties of easy, medium, hard, which essentially just features smaller bots with the harder versions. The first one is titled Varied, and you guessed it, it has a variety of smoothness scenarios. I just covered my opinion on best in breed smoothness sends, and the Varied routine has pretty much all of them, so just run this if you want all the best compound scenarios. Good news is nearly all of these scenarios are also available in AimLab. They're just that good. The XY routine he put together includes the KVA and circle track scenarios I mentioned earlier. They are interesting and fun to play, not to mention cover aim components you don't often see featured. I really like the smooth vert and vert smooth scenarios for having unusual momentum swings. They feel buttery to play and help prevent you from zoning out while training. Finally, the Passu track smooth is excellent for smoothness training in all directions without feeling too much like a Passu training scenario. Voltaic smoothness routine is also quite good. They have an easy and intermediate version which generally feature variations of the same scenario types we've already covered. The exception being they focus a lot more on air type bot movement and smaller, more precise dots, like with the DDTV XYZ scenarios, which are fantastic for building up your wrist movements. If pure density of similar scenarios are your thing, look no further than Fallen smoothness routines. They feature tons of variations of most of the scenarios we've already discussed, intended to be played in a one-by-one fashion. He suggests running them at 1.1 to 1.3 times your normal sensitivity, similar to what we discussed earlier on my section of settings. It's not a RID video without a common mistakes section. So the first is overtraining smoothness. This was super prevalent in the AIM community to just diagnose every single VOD review as a smoothness problem. Unclean lines and static, smoothness. Slow target switches, smoothness. Poor reading skills and reactive tracking, strangely also smoothness. Don't get me wrong, training smoothness is extremely important, but it's not the answer to every problem. The primary indicator for smoothness problems is if you're tracking a target with a semi-auto gun for a few seconds and you notice a lot of jitter, where your crosshair keeps falling off the target. Next is getting too caught up on the exact sensitivity multiplier you should use when training smoothness. I get this question all the time. There's really two main reasons why you would want to increase your sensitivity. One is to make smooth tracking more difficult. Why does it become more difficult? That leads into the second reason, because when you increase your sends, you're naturally going to use more of your wrist and fingertips to control the mouse. If you look at the composition of your arm, the larger muscle groupings, nerves, tendons, more associated with stability are closer to your shoulder. The smaller ones, more associated with control, are closer to your wrist. This is just science. If you're facing a predictable moving target, then using more of your upper arm and shoulder will make your shots more reliable. So you would want to increase your sensitivity to intentionally develop the muscles and nerves in your wrist that are required for aim. Next is not smoothly reacting back. If I had to name the most difficult problem aimers face and FPS players in general, it would be their inability to smoothly react to targets changing direction. Hell, I suffer from this problem to this day. I don't think it's ever something you can completely solve, because in FPS games you deal with a lot of unique strafe patterns, movement prediction, and hand interdependence, which are naturally at odds with developing smoothly reacting. So I think this is just something you need to always be aware of and try to minimize. As I mentioned before, smooth thin strafes, also known as needle track strafing in AimLab, is probably the best scenario to train on for focusing this. But generically, any smooth tracking scenario with some amount of reactivity, and especially variable strafe patterns like VSS scenarios in Kovacs, they're excellent for focusing on this. Over-predicting, this is probably the most common problem people have when doing smooth tracking, especially when they're starting out. It's counterintuitive, sort of like patting your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time, but it's something if you consciously think about while you are training and working on eliminating it, over time you'll improve at it. Similar to the smooth reacting problem, this is a problem that will continue to show up throughout all your aim journeys, so just be aware of it when it's happening and then force yourself not to do it. And now we've reached the end of our smooth tracking journey. Make sure to invest time in the scenarios and routines that we talked about, and you too will be able to one-clip people in games. Next up in the foundational aim series will be evasive target switching, which requires a good amount of smooth tracking, so get your practice in now before we move on to that topic. I'll see you next time.
I'm Rid, and I make content about how to improve your aim.